Welcome, everyone, to the third of the Birkbeck lecture series, which is overall entitled The First Iranians, Empire, Religion, and Ethnicity in Late Antiquity. And today's talk is Patrimonies for the Soul, a cryptic phrase that I hope will make more and more sense as the talk progresses, but essentially alludes to an institution that you have visible here on the reverse of the coinage that I mentioned, which begins to be issued precisely in the year of the inauguration of the empire, 224 CE, which displays a Zoroastrian fire temple, a consistent theme across Iranian coinage, which I mentioned in the first lecture, is remarkable for a number of reasons, but notably for its almost complete homogeneity. That this fire temple remains the symbol used for 4 centuries, almost exclusively. And that's the institution that I'm going to address today. To provide orientation for those of you who've not attended the first 2 lectures, the fundamental argument joining the different components of these talks is that the ethnic discourse of an Iranian identity embodied the entwining of religion and empire in late antiquity, specifically the interdependence of the Zoroastrian religion and the so-called Iranian empire, a state that integrated the disparate territories from Arabia to Afghanistan for 4 centuries, 224 to 636 CE, in what I've argued is the most enduring, politically stable imperial order of the pre-modern Middle East. In naming the empire Iranian at its origins in 224, the court invited its elite to adopt what had hitherto been an entirely mythical religious identity for themselves, to define their membership in a new imperial project. That Iranian identity entitled aristocratic males to a variety of privileges, and in the lecture on November 3rd, I outlined the most politically consequential of such privileges, namely access to Zoroastrian jurisprudence, the services that Zoroastrian priest judges provided and made available to aristocratic Iranian males. These institutions would guarantee the biological reproduction of each aristocratic patrilineage that formed the imagined Iranian community. They did so through the reproductive coercion of aristocratic women, through temporary marriage, and through an institution that I've translated as substitute successorship, or in Middle Persian, sturi, which guarantees a male heir to every single Iranian aristocratic male, even if he dies without sons. Or I should say, even and especially if he dies without sons. Today I'll turn from the role of the Zoroastrian religion in the reproduction of an imperial elite toward its role in the expansion and consolidation of aristocratic patrimonial land, all in the service of making the proposition of an Iranian identity that remained very much theoretical in the 3rd century, of making this proposed Iranian identity plausible, viable, and ultimately indispensable. So I turn from the religious politics of bodies to the religious politics of land. The early Iranian court undertook the most dramatic interventions in the landscapes of the Middle East known from antiquity. And I regret the absence today of a couple of noted archaeologists working on the Iranian world who are absent for the same conference, but will return next week. At the same time as the court of Ardashir began to mint its coins in 224 CE, the construction of a monumental capital at the heart of the region of Persia was already underway. And also, just to clarify terminology for those of you who have not attended the first 2 lectures, when I use the word Iranian, I'm speaking specifically of an empire that knew itself as Iran-Shah, which is the etymological origin of the word we use in English today, Iranian, not the kind of lumpen term to describe all sort of cultures emerging from the territory of what is today Iran, or linguistically, the Iranian languages. And by Persia here, I'm referring precisely to the region of what is today Fars, or in the ancient world known as Persia, in the Zagros mountain region. The city of Ardeshir took its name not only from the name of the first Iranian ruler, but also from the cosmic force suffusing the bodies of legitimate kings of kings. And as some of you may recall from the first lecture, according to the Zoroastrian cosmological framework that the Paikuli inscription outlined, the divine, in the year 293 CE, the divine power of Khvara animated the governance of good, legitimate rulers, and the disappearance of this force, Khvara, which you see in the label, the name of the city here, necessitated the dethroning of a hitherto legitimate ruler. The city itself, the name suggests, embodied the power of Khvara that Ardeshir, the first Iranian ruler, claimed to channel. Its architecture and plan reinforced the religious messaging of the other media through which the court propagated its vision of an Iranian community. A monumental Zoroastrian fire temple appeared at the very center of the city, built of glimmering ashlar, in contrast to the otherwise ubiquitous mud brick, and therefore the only monument still standing within the city of Ardeshir. Well, standing ruinously. More tellingly, the landscape surrounding the city was extensively reworked to form an image of Zoroastrian cosmological ideals, a kind of paradise. And here I'll remind you, the term paradise ultimately derives from an Old Persian Zoroastrian institution of a cosmically functional garden representing the perfection that Zoroastrian rituals and practice were designed to achieve on earth, and by extension, Zoroastrian political orders could achieve within the world. A network of canals filled a moat around the city as a means not of fortification, but of irrigation. The court transformed the entirety of the hinterland into agriculturally productive terrain. And until recently, this was less impressive than it actually is. In fact, this was no small achievement. We know from very recent geoarchaeological studies that the so-called Firuzabad Basin was not only uninhabited, but actually uninhabitable until the early 3rd century. A swampy marshland that shows no signs of occupation until precisely this period in the early 3rd century CE. And it then proceeds to become one of the largest slices of arable agricultural land within the entire region of Persia, within the span of a decade at most. The court's hydraulic interventions transformed the roughly 150 square kilometer plain into an arable island amid the highlands of Persia. And I invite you to take a look at this site on Google Earth, and you can see even from satellite imagery how impressive that island remains today. The expansion of agricultural production constituted, alongside the production of humans, the fundamental means by which humans were believed to contribute to the cosmic restoration of the Zoroastrian religion. This was, perhaps unsurprisingly, the most widely embraced Zoroastrian concept in late antiquity. Across thousands of Middle Persian inscriptions, seals, coins, documents, not to mention the surviving textual tradition, the single most commonly recurring term in Middle Persian is abzon, a term that literally means growth or grow, but in this case is a Zoroastrian cosmological ideal of increasing the quantity of plants grown in service of this sort of imagined cosmic restoration. At Ardeshir, we find a monument in the landscape exhibiting this entwining of the material and the immaterial, the religious and the economic, at the heart of the Iranian imperial project. Increasing arable land enhanced the treasury, the tax take of the emerging court. It also elegantly communicated the authenticity of its still highly debatable claim to have reestablished the rule of these mythical Iranians who would accelerate the perfection of the world. Again, this is a purely theoretical notion in the 3rd century. No one yet knows who these Iranians of myth actually are, and we have no evidence that aristocrats are actually embracing that term for themselves yet. Within the Iranian framework, one could fulfill one's religious obligations through increasing economic production, directly reinforcing the power of the regime, something that I've elsewhere characterized, not without a sense of irony, as Zoroastrian materialism. Ardashir would go on to establish at least 7 more such cities, and his successor Shapur continued the practice. So too would numerous subsequent rulers, and I've just listed here some of the best known, most famous of these cities, even though there are many others. These were not cities according to traditional ancient Mesopotamian or Greek models. They were known as Shahristan, subject to direct imperial authority. In contrast, in self-conscious contrast, with the self-governing polis that continued to operate in the Middle East into the 3rd century. Institutions of polis self-government, like the Vuli, disappear together with the Greek epigraphic tradition in the course of the 3rd century, in conjunction with the proliferation of these so-called Shahristan. Not infrequently was the destruction of the polis a violent event. Shapur II flattened the last surviving polis, at least according to the documentation we possess, the city of Susa, together with its urban elite, with elephants at the beginning of the 4th century. Early Iranian urban foundations were concentrated in a few regions, Persia, Khuzestan, and Mesopotamia, but the 5th century Han conquests that I discussed in the last lecture inspire a turn toward frontier regions in the Caucasus and in the Northeast, Khorasan, as part of these infrastructural developments that the court that invests in order to prevent further Han conquest of Iranian territory. Each Shahristan possessed 3 defining features. What's the difference between a Shahristan and a polis, apart from the question of self-government? A centrally designed urban plan, circular or rectangular, extensively irrigated hinterlands thanks to capital-intensive investment, and not least, a Zoroastrian fire temple as its monumental center. They came to house primarily populations of captives, communities deported from the Roman Empire and settled in cities and satellite agricultural settlements as a source of dependent labor. Iranian kings of kings had the good fortune to conquer some of the best of what my liberal economist colleagues at the University of Chicago would call human capital, available in the ancient Mediterranean. Highly skilled artisans, such as those of the city of Antioch. Their Shahristan would emerge as specialized centers of production of the luxurious metalwork and textiles, such as silk brocade, with which the court compensated loyal aristocrats. And the court would also engage in a highly profitable trans-regional, trans-imperial commerce with the Roman world, and indeed with more distant regions of Central Asia and China. It's not an accident that in Tang China, many of the stylistic trends belong precisely to the kinds of products the court's producing in centers like this city, or Shahristan, Iran Khwara Shapur. And I'll actually come back to these luxury products in the final lecture next week. Revealingly, the second Iranian ruler, Shapur, referred to his cities in his inscription as a dastgird, a Middle Persian term meaning literally what is held in the hand, right? That over which a landlord has direct control. Directly administered patrimonial property, if you like. It was a term that normally designated aristocratic landed estates, and its usage to refer to cities is suggestive of the political economic strategies the court is beginning to deploy in the 3rd century. The cities comprised the dastgird of the ruling house, or more properly, the cities together with their agricultural hinterlands. It's important to recall here the audience of Shapur I's inscription, which I discussed in the first lecture, which was a convention of aristocrats on campaign. Right? So this is a moment in time and space when the court actually can speak to congregated groups of aristocrats who, for at least once in the calendar year, find themselves within the same ceremonial space. They will have understood his usage of the term in exclusive terms. As long as the ruling house possessed its own growing Dastgird, it would have no interest in encroaching on their properties. The Shahristan formed an archipelago of islands in a sea of aristocratic patrimonies. The kings of kings would not compete with the great men of the empire, the Buzurgan, for sources of labor or for land. In contrast, the cosmological framework of growth, this Middle Persian cosmological term abzon, was available to all Iranians, to aristocrats and kings alike, and they're invited to take a share of the newly arable land that court-sponsored infrastructural projects were rapidly bringing into being. These aristocratic shares in economic growth could take a straightforward, familiar form. Literary accounts routinely describe grants of extensive territories as compensation for successful military performance. The House of Karain, one of the 5 largest aristocratic houses in the empire, for example, comes into the possession of vast landholdings in the Caspian region, one of the easiest regions to exploit, right, famously fertile, and on the other side of the mountains from the regime, so relatively easy to maintain one's autonomy, in compensation for a single military campaign against the Turks in the 6th century. And we have numerous other examples in the 3rd and 4th century in the course of these campaigns against the Romans, which I've described in earlier talks. We have precisely the same phenomenon, land grants in northern Mesopotamia, for example, in the frontier regions, being granted to leading aristocratic commanders and their houses. These transfers also resulted in the concentration of Iranian aristocratic houses in regions where Zoroastrian traditions had hitherto been entirely marginal. Northern Mesopotamia, for example, the Zoroastrian presence is pretty thin before the late 3rd and 4th centuries. The newly irrigated terrain the court brought into being across the empire entered aristocratic as well as royal Dastgird estates. So too did deported laborers from Rome. And this is something that's gone missing in previous accounts. We have lots of stories of captives being granted to aristocratic estates, not just to royal estates like the Dastgird of Shapur. There were robust material incentives to participate in this Iranian imperial project alongside the immaterial Iranian ideology. The court, together with its Zoroastrian priest scholars or priest jurists, I can never decide which term I like better, innovated an institution that interwove these material and immaterial incentives to create firm, enduring anchors of aristocratic Iranian power. It is this institution that stood at the center of the first major Iranian Shahristan, namely the fire temple. The basic institution of the Zoroastrian religion is the so-called fire temple, typically known in Middle Persian simply as fires, as ador, sometimes as adorgah, like fireplaces, although not in the sense of a modern fireplace, right? It's a site where fire shrine. These fire temples house the yasna liturgy, as well as lesser ancillary rituals, and these structures could range from the simplest of platforms to massive complexes nearly urban in scale. The origins of the fire temple are nebulous, at best, frankly. And I'm going to overlook here the extensive debate concerning the nature of the earliest fire temples, many of which were clearly open air, explicitly engaging with the surrounding environment, an aspect of the earliest documented supposed fire temples that remains relevant to the understanding of fire temples in the Iranian era, where we see this similar engagement with the surrounding environment, a preference for mountaintops and springs and sources of water, etc. We now possess an unambiguous, richly documented example of a monumentalized fire temple structure from the pre-Iranian era, from the centuries before the empire, at the 1st through 3rd century site of Akchakan in Khwarezm, in the Aral Sea region of what is today Uzbekistan. And here the fire temple is located within a royal complex, within a royal palace, which is suggestive of the ways in which rulers are beginning to experiment with the fire temple as an icon of, or institution, entrenching royal power. So monumental fire temples are clearly not an innovation of the Iranian court, nor was their role as a support for royal power. Indeed, fire temples of one kind or another appear to have operated continuously in the region of Persia from the collapse of the Achaemenid Empire through to the 3rd century CE, as their representations on the reverse of the coins of the kings of Persia before the introduction of the Iranian discourse. So what's new about 3rd century Iranian fire temples as opposed to those fire temples that may have pre-existed the empire? Firstly, scale. The regime constructed fires not only at the center of cities, but at numerous sites in rural contexts across the empire, and in so doing inspired aristocratic houses themselves to invest in the construction of fire temples. Secondly, the development of a jurisprudential framework around these monuments that gave them central organizing roles within regional economies and societies. To return to the example of the monument at Ardeshir, fires truly came to form a centerpiece of the empire, a foundation of its peculiar political, economic, and political cultural order. If the planners of the site wanted to communicate the symbolic significance of fires at the center of the city, Zoroastrian jurists would proceed to realize their institutional potential over subsequent centuries. In the inscription of Shapur I at Naqsh-e-Rustam, again, discussed from the first lecture, the court proclaimed fires a foundation of the regime and defined their cosmological function in the consolidation of patrimonial power. The second Iranian ruler recorded his establishment of temples alongside the account of his conquests. To quote from the inscription, one fire named Khusro Shapur, for our soul and renown, Pod Ruan, with Panam, for the soul, this is where the title of my talk comes from, as well as other fires for each of his children. This is the first articulation of a phrase denoting a juridical institution, Pad Ruan, for the soul, and the inscription details what this service for the soul was actually supposed to entail. These adur, these fires that Shapur claims to have founded, were not mere monuments, but centers of ongoing religious ritual, especially the yasna, also other liturgies. The conduct of rituals during the lifetime of patrons and after death brought eternal glory, panam, to founders, and preserved their names among the living. Such rituals were pretty costly enterprises. They required a permanent staff of priestly specialists. They required lambs for sacrifice. And we have extensive faunal remains at the sites of fire temples that I'm going to discuss in greater detail in a moment. And I'm going to return to this theme of the consumption of meat and feasting in fire temple contexts in the final talk. We'll talk about Zoroastrian celebrations as sites of Zoroastrian convention and sociability, all around shared pleasures, including feasting. The court of Shapur I made explicit its provisioning of the fires. According to each shrine, each fire is to receive 1 lamb, a measure and a half of bread, and 4 measures of wine. Wine's very important. I'll talk about that more next week. Every single day. This language should be taken as symbolically to indicate the share that priests who serve these fire temples were to be able to extract from the lands endowed within the fire temples in order to sustain themselves and their rituals. For as subsequent sources will make plain, each fire temple came to possess extensive landholdings as endowments supporting the priests, the rituals, and most importantly, actually more importantly, the souls, the names of their patrons, and even more importantly, the patrilineal houses of the living successors to the patrons of these fire temples. We have here yet another unambiguous break with Parthian and Hellenistic political culture. The dynastic sanctuaries of rulers, monumentalized in statue form, whether explicitly deified or not, give way to a Zoroastrian ruler cult that forecloses the possibility of divinization. So within Zoroastrianism, there cannot be a divine king. It's a complete rejection of the tradition of divinized kingship of the Hellenistic and Parthian era. Iranian kings could possess divine lineages. They could have a genealogical connection to divine figures, but they could themselves not be gods. The distinction between rulers and aristocrats here is not a question of divinity, but a question of their respective positions in the hierarchy that their kind of mythical genealogies create. And so Shapur's court can extend the privilege of this fire, which is a little bit like a dynastic cult, to his aristocrats. He can include his aristocrats within a collective commemoration that includes both the ruler and his successors, as well as the aristocrats and their successors. The most remarkable passage of this entire inscription, which I spent, I think, half of the first lecture discussing, right? It's a very important inscription. But everyone ignores the second half. There's almost no commentary whatsoever, because it's a really boring list of the most powerful aristocrats of the empire. Now, that section, to my mind, is the most remarkable, because what we have is an inclusion of the aristocrats within this collective, we can't even really call it, we can call it an interdynastic cult, perhaps, as opposed to a ruler's dynastic cult, because every aristocratic house is included within a collective commemoration, and every aristocrat is included in these fire temple foundations. Now, Shapur does not clarify whether the court constructed separate fires for each of these aristocratic patrilineages, or if they're simply included in the collective commemorations at the fires that Shapur establishes. What's perfectly clear is that aristocrats would begin enthusiastically to embrace the institutional opportunity to establish their own foundations for the soul, and they began to do so already in the middle of the 3rd century. A master of ceremonies at court, known as Abnun, produced one of only a handful of non-royal inscriptions known from the 3rd century to communicate his construction of a fire temple in Adorgah. He did so by his own account, in gratitude to the gods for Shapur's victory over the Romans under the Emperor Galerian in 243 CE. It's a fascinating insight into how victory in a military campaign reinforces the Zoroastrian commitments of an emerging aristocratic community in which martial triumph would prove the authenticity of the claim to have reestablished this sort of mythical, historical, cosmological, or universal sovereignty, which is what the word Iran, right, actually means. The site of the fire temple in the inscription is significant. Do I dare try the pointer again? Yeah, it works good, great. It's located among the crags surrounding a spring within the massif overlooking what is today the city of Shiraz. So it's in this area here. Already in Antiquity, in the Parthian and Iranian era, a major urban center. Right? Maybe familiar to some of you as the best university in Iran, at least for the sciences. It's a revealing early example of the tendency to harness the cosmic forces believed to be embedded in the landscape, while at the same time articulating a kind of domination over the surrounding arable lands, the economic basis of aristocratic power, as you see here. Abnun was unique in having an account of his foundation survive into modernity, and it's an open question whether the Iranian community lost the epigraphic habit for cultural reasons, because private inscriptions, generally speaking, disappear after this period. It's unclear whether this is a kind of so-called end of the epigraphic habit culturally, or whether they begin to produce inscriptions in mud brick, or probably more likely in plaster stucco, which is used to decorate the interior of aristocratic residences as well as fire temples. But in either case, we possess precious few inscriptions of this kind from later eras, although we do have a few. It's revealing, The archaeology nevertheless leaves little doubt concerning the large-scale aristocratic embrace of the practice of founding fires. The earliest major fire temple complex in which the Iranian court promoted this institution, the earliest major fire temple complex that reveals aristocratic engagement with the court's promotion of the institution that can be scientifically dated with any degree of certainty is at a site called Nakhlak in Persia that dates precisely to the middle of the 3rd century. That fire temple takes the shape of the so-called chahartaq architectural form, which literally just refers to 4 arches, which becomes a widely recognizable form for fire temples in the Iranian era and would have a long afterlife in the Islamic world in a variety of religious and secular contexts. There are dozens of surviving chahartaq fire temples across the empire. And here, I mean the empire east of Mesopotamia. And so we have one big evidentiary problem that these structures tend to survive when they're built out of stone being readily available in the Zagros and the Iranian plateau, whereas in Mesopotamia, these constructions would have been built out of mud brick and therefore do not typically survive unless they are intentionally excavated. And archaeologists working in Mesopotamia, well, let's just put things plainly, totally ignore this period with very few exceptions. Christian texts, however, in Syriac, describe fire temple constructions as being a typical feature of the Mesopotamian landscape. So we know that these structures are also being built in Mesopotamia, even though we do not have any archaeologically sort of observable examples. So from the 3rd century onward, the fire temples that the court had placed on its earliest coinage became increasingly prominent across the imperial landscape, in cities, along major roads, and on mountains overlooking rural exploitations. It's one of the exciting developments in the contemporary archaeology of Iran that younger scholars have begun to return to long-known chahartaq sites that have basically been neglected since the 1960s to begin to undertake excavations. And so I'll draw on their work over the next couple minutes. Here you have a map that indicates with triangles a number of the best-known fire temple sites, by no means comprehensively. There are many more that are not indicated on this map. These recent archaeological projects emphasize several common characteristics of Iranian fire temples, even if they, frustratingly, cannot yet provide a precise chronology of their evolution. I could go into the reason why that's the case, but I'll leave that to the question to the side. Firstly, they tend to occupy dramatic sites in the landscape, high points overlooking valleys, and often in proximity to sacred sources of water. Secondly, they tend to be richly decorated with precisely the same plaster stucco that we know to have been typical of aristocratic residences and royal palaces. There's a clear sort of intervisual sort of legibility to these institutions within elite cultures. And thirdly, they tend to be located in proximity to and in dialogue with aristocratic residences, or as I've already mentioned, the monumental centers of cities. For only one such fire temple do we possess literary evidence that enables us to chart its development and to chart its social, political, and economic context. In the middle of the 5th century, a leading aristocrat from the house of Suren, again, one of the 5 most powerful houses in the empire, named Mehrnarse, founded 5 fire temples in the region of Persia, according to an account preserved in the work of the early Islamic historiographer al-Tabari. The passage bears consideration in full. And I'll read just some sections of this. He constructs a fire temple, which is said to be still in existence today, with the fire still burning to the present moment. It's called Mehrnarsian. In the vicinity of Abruwan, he founded 4 villages with a fire temple in each one. The second one was meant for his son Zorvandad, the third for his son Kardar, the last for his son Magus, probably. He also laid out 3 gardens in this region. In one of them, he planted 12,000 date palms. in another 12,000 olive trees, and in the third garden, 12,000 cypress trees. These villages, with the gardens and the fire temples, have remained continuously in the hands of his descendants. Now, Tabari is writing in the 9th century to give us some idea of what he's describing. Now, this passage lends social and economic depth to the institution of the fire temple. To each of those chahartak that have survived archaeologically without a story to tell. That is, we have this problem, the chahartak survive, and yet we know virtually nothing about what they represented socially and economically within their context. The endowments granted to these fires were massive and massively profitable. Exploitations that would have formed a significant, if not the dominant share of the regional economy of these valleys in Persia. One of these 5 temples likely continues to stand in the province of Fars, or Persia. The archaeologist Dietrich Hoff has shown that the Chahartak of Jireh, which you see here, conforms precisely with the description of Tabari. It overlooks the lush Dalaki River Valley, among the most fertile regions of Persia, a landscape that could have sustained extensive exploitation. Sorry, I didn't notice that my voice recognition software decided to insert itself. It served as a symbolic center of a rural region that seems to have comprised in its totality the patrimonial domain of one of the greatest houses of the empire, Suren. It's very likely that the patron of the temple, Mihernarse, or one of his sons, was also entombed at the site together with his descendants. The last survey in the 1970s reported a number of astodon. Astodon are ossuaries carved into cliffs or carved into individual rocks. You've got 2 different, these are not from the site of Jireh, by the way. This is from a recently excavated site on Mount Zaneh. The ones on the left are from Nakhchivan, on the site of Shapur's inscription. According to Zoroastrian cosmology, a corpse could not come into contact with sacred elements, water or soil, so rock-cut tombs become the preferred storehouse of the bones of those whose memories were believed to be worth preserving. This is a pattern that recurs elsewhere at fire temples that frequently form the centerpiece of a wider mortuary landscape, recording the names of the Iranians deceased in perpetuity. Temples and tombs combine to exercise a kind of spiritual domination of the landscape, entrenching the economic domination of aristocratic houses. These fire temples and their tombs are overlooking the valleys that these aristocrats own as their patrilineal patrimonies. The account of the fire temple foundations reveals the implications of an institution known from the Thousand Judgments, the Hazar Dadistan, for the social and political history of the empire, and the ways in which aristocratic houses could transform landscapes quite as dramatically as did the kings of kings. For those of you who were not present for the last lecture, the Thousand Judgments is a Zoroastrian juridical compendium dated to the early 7th century that contains episodes of case law dating from the 4th through 7th centuries and preserves the operation of a Zoroastrian jurisprudence concerned primarily with, actually almost exclusively, with facilitating the intergenerational transmission of Iranian power, specifically individual Iranian patrilineages. Among the most important juridical institutions in the Thousand Judgments, arguably second only to the institution of substitute successorship, or sturi, that I discussed 2 weeks ago, is the foundation for the soul, Pod Ruwan. And here, the usage of Shapur I in the inscription that I've mentioned, his usage of the precise phrase, Pod Ruwan, in the year 260 CE, suggests that already in the 3rd century, Zoroastrian jurists are facilitating these endowments for the soul. But they really only emerge in the fullness of their complexity in this early 7th century text, drawing on much earlier juridical materials. Here, an institution which is usually translated as charitable foundation appears in specific or general forms. The most specific form is something called Ruwan Yazishin, which is 4 rituals of the soul, which is designed primarily to fund the conduct of liturgies at fire temples, the actual practice of the rituals themselves. But by far the most common form of endowment is not that more restrictive institution, but rather a very general term, padruan, literally, again, for the soul. And this institution is so, so open-ended in general that the term charitable foundation, I think, isn't really appropriate. In terms of how we understand, if we're just translating this into plain English, what we associate with a charitable foundation has really nothing to do with how padruan endowments actually operated. They constitute endowments of property whose surplus was to be deployed, very generally, in the service of cosmologically beneficial work. Now, some of you might recall from the last lecture, such work could be pretty banal, right? Sexual activity aimed at reproduction, planting of crops, right? These are the two fundamental forms of cosmologically beneficial work. So essentially, we have endowments that can be used for those two purposes. And those two purposes are understood as religious, right? So the word charitable, with its kind of Christian connotations, I think is not particularly helpful. Examples from the Thousand Judgments range from bringing new lands into cultivation by funding the construction of irrigation infrastructure, for example, to the building of roads, to more conventionally charitable activities like providing for the poor. We could debate who these poor, the so-called Drioshan, in fact, are. In 4th and 5th century inscriptions, respectively, aristocrats described the construction of a fortress and of bridges as activities for the soul. So if building your own fortified residence is an act for the soul, the English phrase charitable foundation, I think doesn't really capture what's going on. All these examples I've described today, ranging from the inscription of Shapur I to the fires of Mehr Narseh, to this castle in Azerbaijan of the aristocrat Narseh, take for granted the continued identification of a foundation with the patrilineal community of the founder. And this is characteristic of foundations across the board. So every endowment padruan remains in the ownership of the patrilineal house of the founder. Zoroastrian priests, or the fire temple itself, the ador, only have possession, not ownership. Only the administrator or the guardian, the salar, could act legally in the name of the foundation, not the Zoroastrian priest who might be the beneficiary, for instance, even though he himself might in fact be a judge. Again, typically Zoroastrian priests are also judges. So there it's even more significant that they're not allowed to act legally in the name of the endowments that theoretically they control. Only the salar, and the salar, the representative, the guardian, is almost always drawn from the patrilineal male descendants of the founder. They may have been established for the soul, but in practice these endowments function for the house. They serve the aristocratic family that makes the establishment. And if we're looking for an English word that captures the characteristics of the institution, I think the term trust is much more fit for purpose than charitable foundation. And a legal historian in Budapest, János, has argued exactly that. Houses did not only benefit from the symbolic capital of trusts, funding fire temples and rituals and articulating their authority over a landscape, as I've illustrated, they also derived more conventional profits by taking a share in what the jurists called the bar, the surplus, in contrast with the foundation itself, the bun, so the initial principle. The question of how much surplus the patrilineal descendants of a founder could extract from a trust or a fire temple endowment depended on the arrangements of the founder. And these could range from only receiving compensation for one's service as the administrator, the salar, dedicating the remaining surplus to ritual activities, that's sort of the most restrictive version, to enjoying all of the profits of the endowment as long as the ritual endowment remains undiminished. So as long as, there are cases where as long as you're not eroding the initial principle, you, as the male descendant of the founder, can use all of the surplus of the Fire Temple endowment to your own liking. Zoroastrian jurists were supposed to intervene only in cases where the trust failed to yield dividends. And the salar, the administrators, are encouraged to invest the principal in ways that increased the productivity of the property. So here, this kind of Zoroastrian concept of abzon, growth, has real, it's a cosmological idea that is clearly animating the practice of these jurists. Right? The idea is that property should be invested to create more wealth. As was the case with the reproductive regime that I described a couple weeks ago, the court served as the final guarantor of these trusts, with at least one, and possibly even two, administrative centers in the imperial capital that were concerned expressly with managing the proprietary arrangements of foundations for the soul. So this idea of a diwan i ruwalagan, so basically a diwan, an administrative center, dedicated to record keeping concerning all of the trusts across the empire. In encouraging members of the emerging Iranian community to establish fires, the court of Shapur I was not simply enjoining aristocrats to acts of piety. It was also outlining their access to a juridical institution through which they could guarantee the intergenerational transmission and also the intergenerational growth of their patrimonies. And at the same time, they could sacralize their landholdings. The Zoroastrian trust provided enormous advantages to aristocrats who would adopt the Iranian Zoroastrian identity for themselves. Landholdings invested in an endowment for the soul could not be expropriated and cannot be eroded. They're to grow in perpetuity. Importantly, even the kings of kings cannot take property in an endowment. Pretty valuable insurance policy in a highly violent, competitive, aristocratic political culture. King of Kings might not like you very much, and he may, in the end, off you if you really cause problems. But, as I discussed a couple weeks ago, he's going to guarantee that you will have a son as your legal heir, and he will guarantee that your property remains in the possession of your son. So you, as an individual, are totally dispensable. Your house is not. Your house is guaranteed transmission in perpetuity as long as the empire endures. The surviving fire temples of the Iranian world attest not only to the interest of the court in strengthening its Zoroastrian religious infrastructure, in increasing the number of rituals that are performed, but also in the growth of endowments that came to dominate the agricultural economy in numerous regions and to guarantee the positions of those aristocratic houses on whom the court depended for its military power and also for its administrative power. The most obvious comparison to my mind, although this certainly doesn't include the military or administrative power, is Christian monasticism. Right? We see some similarities here. The continued growth of proprietary portfolios under a kind of corporate authority, corporate ownership, that a juridical regime insulates against the vagaries of time, against political expropriation, against fragmentation among heirs, against squandering administrators. The difference, however, is, I think, more telling, because the continuation of an Iranian patrilineage, an Iranian aristocratic patrilineage itself is a religious cosmological goal. The individual aristocratic houses that together formed the Iranian community enjoyed the ever-growing surplus that their trusts produce. So here's the contrast with the way we think about monastic property. Nearly a century of archaeological fieldwork has documented the unprecedented expansion of irrigation agriculture in the course of 4 centuries of Iranian rule. In the traditionally core agricultural regions of Mesopotamia and Khuzestan, but also in Persia, and more recently across the Caucasus and what is today northwestern Iran, Azerbaijan, and the Russian province of Dagestan, and in the northeastern parts of the empire, in what is today the modern Iranian province of Khorasan, parts of Turkmenistan, etc. This was a pan-imperial phenomenon, unambiguously a result of imperial intervention. Capital-intensive investment in the construction of canals, qanats, sort of underground, channels, and their associated infrastructure. To take one recently published example for illustrative purposes, Mitra Panahipur has demonstrated a doubling of the number of agricultural settlements in conjunction with canal construction in the Iraqi province of Diyala, in a publication from 2 years ago. Such were the economic consequences of the stability of a regime that, at its very outset, defined its goal as abzon, as growth. The growth of the agrarian economy understood in Zoroastrian cosmological terms. Most clearly, with the foundation of Ardashirkhvara as a kind of urban garden, an urban paradise, illustrating the entwining of the material and immaterial, the growth of the Zoroastrian religion, as also resulting in the growth of the agricultural economy, the basis of both royal and aristocratic power. To conclude, what I've argued today is that we should view such agricultural expansion as the political, economic, and political cultural underpinning of the Iranian community, the imagined community of aristocrats and kings cooperating in a shared imperial and religious project. These newly watered lands formed sacred landscapes, even if they were not endowed in the service of fire temples or graced with monumental fires or tombs. Growth itself was a cosmological religious end, as was the enriching of aristocratic communities imagined as ontologically, cosmologically superior to other kinds of human. But the archaeological and textual evidence reveals a vast, if incalculable, share of these lands sustained fires. That is, these lands were invested in fire temple endowments. Their surplus supported Zoroastrian rituals and the construction of shrines that came to form a recognizably Zoroastrian Iranian landscape across the empire. These lands did not simply enhance the proprietary portfolios of Iranian aristocrats. They also enhanced their Iranian identities. The commemoration of their souls communicated their mythical historical lineages across generations, consolidated properties within a patrilineal house, and cemented their claim on a landscape. Like the cities, or Shahristan, that so often had the idea of the Iranians in their names, fire temples propagated the Iranian ideology while at the same time expanding its material foundations, its material incentives to aristocratic participation in the imperial project. Thank you for your time, and of course, I welcome questions.